6:32 in the morning on May 27, 1942, Commander Joseph Rockefort stood in the basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, staring at a decoded message that likely signaled the potential destruction of the American Pacific Fleet. The message came from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and contained operational orders for a massive strike on an American base designated AF. For Japanese aircraft carriers, over 250 planes, an invasion force, complete surprise. The Americans might have only 3 carriers to defend with. If Yamamoto caught them unprepared again, the war in the Pacific could be lost. Rockefort had been running Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor, for 11 months. He knew the Japanese naval code inside and out and could decipher encrypted messages faster than most of his team. Yet one problem had been keeping him awake for nights on end, one problem that threatened to kill thousands of American sailors if he couldn't resolve it. Nobody in Washington accepted his interpretation of AF. Rockefort was certain AF referred to Midway, a tiny speck of land 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Washington's intelligence analysts insisted it meant somewhere else, maybe the Aleutians, maybe Port Moresby in New Guinea, or perhaps even the U.S. West Coast. The debate had dragged on for 3 weeks. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, trusted Rockefort, but he needed proof evidence Washington could not ignore, something to convince Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, to commit America's last carriers to battle at Midway instead of keeping them to defend Hawaii or the mainland. The problem was not that American codebreakers lacked the skill to read Japanese transmissions. They had been penetrating the Japanese naval code, designated JN-25B, since early 1942. Rockefort's team at Station Hypo, in collaboration with units in Melbourne and Washington, had cracked enough of the code to read fragments of most messages. Perhaps 50% of the code groups were known. The rest had to be inferred from context. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. But the Japanese were cunning. They changed their codebooks every few months, used code names for locations, vessels, and operations, and knew the Americans were listening. They continually rotated designations, introduced new code groups, and made interception progressively harder. AF could mean anything. Absolute certainty was impossible without confirmation from the Japanese themselves. Rockefort had raised this with Admiral Nimitz 2 weeks earlier. Nimitz had asked what could be done. Rockefort had explained there was a way to confirm it, but it required breaching operational security. It meant broadcasting information about an American base in the clear, unencrypted, where the Japanese could intercept it, gambling that they would respond in their code and thus verify the target. Nimitz had studied Rockefort for a long moment and then said, "Do it. Don't inform Washington. Just do it." The first sailor Rockefort felt he had failed was Seaman First Class James Anderson. On December 7, 1941, Anderson had been stationed on the USS Arizona. Rockefort had been in the administration building basement that Sunday morning, working on Japanese intercepts with his team. They had tracked increased Japanese naval radio traffic for weeks, sensing something was imminent, yet unable to determine where or when. Cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had intercepted fragments suggesting a large fleet movement, carriers, battleships, hundreds of aircraft, but the destination code groups were new, unbreakable, unknown. 7:55 that morning, Rockefort heard the explosions. He ran outside and saw smoke rising from Battleship Row. Japanese aircraft were everywhere, dropping bombs and torpedoes and strafing with machine gun fire. The Arizona exploded at 8:10. A bomb had penetrated the forward magazine. 1,177 men died instantly. Anderson, 24 years old, born in Oregon and formerly a ranch hand, was among them. Rockefort had never met him, but he had been working on intelligence that might have warned the fleet and prevented the attack, and he had failed. The warning hadn't reached the fleet. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese killed 2,403 Americans, sank or damaged 21 ships, and destroyed 188 aircraft. 8 battleships were hit, 5 sunk, leaving the Pacific Fleet crippled in a single morning. Official reports claimed the intelligence community had missed the signs, but Rockefort knew better. Station Hypo had seen the signals, reported increased radio traffic, and flagged fleet movements, but the pieces hadn't come together in time. The Japanese changed call signs on December 1 and imposed strict radio silence on the attack force, leaving neither Hypo nor Washington able to assemble the puzzle quickly enough to warn Pearl Harbor. Rockefort stood on the dock that afternoon, watching sailors pull bodies from the water. Oil still burned, smoke still rose, and the acrid smell of charred metal and fuel filled the air. Rockefort understood he would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for December 7, dedicating himself to ensuring it never happened again. He returned to the basement, to intercepts and code groups. His team worked 20-hour days, 36-hour shifts. They slept on chairs in the corners, ate at their desks. The concrete floor was cold, ventilation poor, and fluorescent lights never went out, but they continued breaking codes, reading messages, and tracking the Japanese fleet. The second failure that weighed on Rockefort was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. Station Hypo had provided intelligence enabling the Navy to intercept a Japanese invasion force bound for Port Moresby in New Guinea. The engagement had been a tactical draw, though the Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho. The Americans had lost the carrier Lexington, but it had been a strategic victory because the Japanese invasion force had turned back. Rochefort had been proud of that intelligence work. His team had identified the Japanese objective. They'd tracked the fleet movements. They'd given Admiral Nimitz enough warning to position American carriers for the intercept. It had worked, but the Lexington was gone. 216 men had died, and Rocher knew that. Intelligence was only useful if it prevented casualties, not just counted them. By mid-May 1942, Rochefort had been running Station Hypo for 11 months. He'd assembled a team of CRYP analysts, linguists, and radio traffic analysts that worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. They'd set up their operations in the basement of the administration building. No windows, concrete walls. The air was stale and hot. The ventilation was terrible, but it was secure. The team included some unusual members. Several were musicians from the USS California's band. The California had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. The band's men had no ship, but they could read music. And reading music turned out to be surprisingly similar to reading code patterns. They could see rhythms in the numbers. They could spot when something was off-key. Rochefort worked in a bathrobe and slippers most of the time. He didn't care about military protocol. He cared about breaking codes. He'd go for days without leaving the basement. His staff worked the same way. They were processing 140 messages a day by May, intercepting Japanese radio traffic, decrypting it, translating it, analyzing it, looking for patterns, looking for clues about Japanese intentions. The basement was freezing. The concrete floor sucked the heat out of everything. In the tropical Hawaiian climate, the Navy had designed the building for cooling, not heating, but the basement stayed cold 24 hours a day. That's why Rochefort wore the bathrobe. That's why his team wore sweaters and jackets while everyone else on the island wore short sleeves. The Japanese used a code system that was fishly complex. Every 5-digit number group represented a word or phrase. There were 45,000 possible code groups. The code groups changed regularly. On top of that, the Japanese added a layer of encryption where they added random numbers to each code group before transmission. So even if you knew the code book, you still had to subtract the random numbers to get the real code groups. And if you didn't know the code book, you had to figure it out from context by comparing thousands of messages. Rochefort had a gift for it. He could see patterns that others missed. He could remember code groups. He could make intuitive leaps about what messages meant, even when half the groups were still unbroken. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed his team. He needed Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who ran the crypt analysis section. Dyer was methodical, patient. He could work through code groups for hours without getting frustrated. He built the mathematical frameworks that made everything else possible. He needed Jasper Holmes, a former submariner who knew the Pacific geography and Japanese naval tactics. Holmes had commanded submarines before the war. He knew every island, every reef, every current in the Pacific. When a message mentioned coordinates or geographic features, Holmes could identify the location faster than anyone else on the team. He needed Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, who'd figured out how the Japanese encrypted their date and time codes. That breakthrough had been crucial. Knowing when something would happen was almost as important as knowing where. Finnegan had worked for weeks on the date-time encryption. He'd filled notebooks with number sequences. He'd tested hundreds of combinations. And finally, in late May, he'd cracked it. Now they could read not just what the Japanese were planning, but when they planned to do it. He needed every linguist and analyst. He had the Japanese language specialists who could translate the decoded messages, the traffic analysts who tracked which units were communicating with which other units, the radio intercept operators who pulled the transmissions out of the air. It was a team effort. Every person mattered, and by my day they were all telling Rochefort the same thing. The Japanese were planning something big, something bigger than Coral Sea, something that involved multiple carrier divisions, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, invasion transports. The operation was scheduled for early June and the target was designated AF. The problem was that Washington's intelligence analysts, working in a section called OP-20G, didn't believe AF was Midway. They thought it was somewhere else, and they had the ear of Admiral King, the man who controlled the entire Navy. King was stubborn. King didn't like Rochefort, and King's staff insisted that Rochefort was wrong. The bureaucratic fight had been going on for weeks. Rochefort would send an intelligence summary to Nimitz, saying AF is Midway. Washington would send a summary to King saying AF is probably the Aleutians or New Guinea. Nimitz would ask for clarification. Washington would insist they were right. Round and round. The worst part was the personalities. Rochefort had a reputation for being difficult. He was caustic, he was sarcastic. He didn't suffer fools. And he'd made enemies in Washington by bypassing the official chain of command. He was supposed to report through OP-20G. Instead, he reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton. Layton and Rochefort were friends. They'd studied Japanese together in Tokyo in the 1930s. They trusted each other, but Washington saw it as insubordination. Commander John Redmond ran OP-20G. Redmond was a communications officer with no CRYP analysis training. He'd replaced Lawrence Safford, who actually understood codering. Redmond didn't like Rochefort, didn't trust him, thought he was a loose cannon, and Redmond had Admiral King's ear. Is Midway? Redmond said. Rochefort is guessing. When Rochefort said the attack is scheduled for June 4th or 5th, Redmond said it's probably mid-June. When Rochefort said commit the carriers to Midway, Redmond said keep them near Hawaii in case AF means an attack on the West Coast. Rochefort knew that thousands of lives depended on being right. If he was wrong about Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, the carriers would be in the wrong position. The Japanese would catch them out of position, just like at Pearl Harbor. More ships sunk, more men dead, and it would be Rochefort's fault for giving bad intelligence. But Rochefort also knew he was right. His team had analyzed hundreds of messages. They tracked the buildup. They'd identified the carriers involved: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiru, the same 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. They'd identified Admiral Nagumo as the strike force commander. They'd identified Yamamoto as the overall commander. They knew the approximate date. They knew the approximate size of the force. The only thing they didn't know for certain was AF, and Washington wouldn't commit the fleet without certainty. On the evening of May 19, 1942, Jasper Holmes came to Rochefort with an idea. Holmes had been thinking about the problem. AF had appeared in messages for weeks. It was always mentioned in the context of an attack. It was always mentioned with freshwater supplies. In one message, the Japanese mentioned that the AF occupation force should bring extra freshwater because local supplies might be limited. Holmes knew the Pacific. He'd commanded submarines. He knew which bases had fresh water and which didn't. Midway Atoll had no natural fresh water. The base depended entirely on desalination plants that converted cedar to drinking water. If those plants failed, Midway would run out of water in a matter of days. Holmes suggested a test. Send a message from Midway saying the desalination plant had broken down. Send it in the clear, unencrypted, so the Japanese would definitely intercept it. Then wait. If AF really was Midway, the Japanese would report the water shortage in their own coded traffic. It would confirm the target beyond any doubt. Rochefort liked it. It was risky. If the Japanese suspected it was a trick, they might change their plans. But it was the only way to get proof that Washington couldn't ignore. He took the idea to Layton. Layton took it to Nimitz. Nimitz approved it. Send the message. Don't tell Washington. See what happens. On May 19th or 20th, Nimitz sent orders to Midway by undersea cable. The cable was secure. The Japanese couldn't intercept cable traffic, the orders told the Midway garrison commander to broadcast an uncoded radio message saying their desalination plant had malfunctioned. Water supplies were running low. They needed emergency repairs. Midway sent the message on May 20th, plain language, no encryption. Any Japanese listening post would pick it up. The message said the distillation system had broken down. Fresh water was limited. The base needed help. Then Rasher and his team waited. They listened to Japanese radio traffic. They intercepted every transmission. They decoded every message they could, looking for any mention of water shortages, looking for any mention of AF. The hours dragged. Nothing. More hours. Still nothing. Rasher started to worry. Had the Japanese suspected a trick? Had they ignored the message? Had they figured it out? On May 22nd, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message. It was encrypted. When they broke it down, the message said, AF reported freshwater shortage. AF would need additional water supplies for the occupation. Ships should bring extra water. Rasher had his proof. AF was Midway. The water RS had worked. The Japanese had taken the bait and confirmed the target in their own code. Washington couldn't argue with that. Except Rasher didn't send the confirmation to Washington. He let Melbourne do it. He knew Washington wouldn't believe it coming from him. They'd think he was manufacturing evidence, but if it came from the Australian intelligence unit, from a separate source, it would carry more weight. Melbourne reported the intercept. Washington accepted it. Finally, Admiral King agreed. AF was Midway. Commit the carriers. What happened in the next 10 days would determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The intelligence work didn't stop with confirming Midway. Rashford's team kept breaking messages. They kept building the picture of what Yamamoto was planning. And the more they learned, the more terrifying it became. The Japanese were committing 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and an invasion force of 5,000 troops. Yamamoto himself would be in command aboard the battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the carrier strike force. It was the largest Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor, and it was designed to destroy the American Pacific Fleet once and for all. The Japanese plan was elegant. Send a diversionary force to attack the Aleutian Islands on June 3, draw American attention north. Then on June 4, hit Midway with carrier aircraft. Destroy the air base, soften up the defenses. On June 5, land the invasion force, occupy the atoll, force the American carriers to come out and fight, and when they did, sink them. Yamamoto believed the Americans had only 2 carriers available, maybe 3 if they'd somehow repaired the Yorktown. After Coral Sea, the Japanese had 4, plus battleships, plus cruisers, plus the element of surprise. The math was simple. The Americans would lose. Except, the Americans knew everything. They knew when the attack was coming. They knew where it was coming. They knew the order of battle. They knew Yamamoto's flagship position. They knew the carrier strike force would approach from the northwest. They knew the timing of the attack. Rasher had given Nimitz every piece of information he needed to set a trap. Nimitz had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, which had been damaged at Coral Sea. The Navy estimated it would take 3 months to repair Yorktown. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. Repair crews worked around the clock, welding, patching, replacing damaged systems. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship. They worked in shifts, day and night. Welders, electricians, carpenters, machinists. They repaired the flight deck. They patched the hull. They replaced damaged compartments. They got Yorktown battle ready in 72 hours. On May 30th, she steamed out of Pearl Harbor to join the other 2 carriers. Nimitz positioned the carriers northeast of Midway at a rendezvous point. His staff optimistically codenamed Point Luck. 350 miles from Midway, far enough to avoid Japanese scouts, close enough to strike when the Japanese carriers were vulnerable. The fleet waited. 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers. Against 4 Japanese carriers and everything Yamamoto could throw at them. The Americans also reinforced Midway. itself. Marine fighters, dive bombers, B-17 heavy bombers, every aircraft they could spare. The tiny atoll became a floating aircraft carrier made of coral. If the Japanese carriers got too close, Midway's aircraft would hit them. On June 3, Japanese aircraft attacked Dutch harbor in the Aleutians. The diversionary operation had started. Nimitz didn't take the bait. He kept the carriers at Point Luck, waiting for Midway. Rushforth's intelligence had told him the illusions were a feint. The real target was Midway. On the morning of June 4 at 5:34 local time, a Navy patrol plane spotted the Japanese carrier Force 200M northwest of Midway, right where Rose said they'd be right on schedule. The pilot radioed the sighting. 2 carriers, course 135, speed 25 knots. Within minutes, every aircraft on Midway scrambled. Marine, fighters, dive bombers, Army Air Force B-7 heavy bombers, torpedo bombers, everything that could fly. They went after the Japanese carriers. Most of them never came back. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol tore them apart. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, better trained. Out of the first wave of Midway-based aircraft, only a handful survived. They inflicted no significant damage on the Japanese fleet, but they'd served their purpose. They'd forced the Japanese to commit their fighters to defense. They'd disrupted the Japanese attack rhythm, and they'd bought time for the American carrier aircraft to launch. 102, Admiral Raymond Spruant, commanding the Enterprise and Hornet, made the critical decision. Launch everything. Every dive bomber, every torpedo bomber, every fighter. Send them after the Japanese carriers before the Japanese could recover and rearm their own aircraft. It was a calculated risk. Launching at extreme range meant the aircraft might not have enough fuel to get back, but if they could catch the Japanese carriers with their aircraft on deck with bombs and fuel lines everywhere, they could destroy them. The American strike force launched at 752. 116 aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet. 67 aircraft from Yorktown launching later. They headed northwest toward the last reported position of the Japanese fleet. Finding the carriers in the open ocean would be like finding 4 needles in a haystack the size of Texas. But the pilots had one advantage. They knew exactly where to look because Rushforth had told them. What happened next was a combination of courage, luck, and timing that changed naval history forever. The first American aircraft to reach the Japanese carriers were torpedo bombers from Hornet Torpedo Squadron 815, aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. They found the Japanese carriers at 920. 4 carriers in a box. Akagi Kaga Soryohiru, surrounded by escorts protected by Zeros. Waldron Squadron, attacked without fighter cover, without dive bomber support. Just 15 slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers against the entire Japanese fleet. The Zeros massacred them, shot them down one by one. Out of 15 aircraft, 14 were destroyed. 29 men killed. Only one survivor, signed George Gay, floating in the ocean, watching the battle. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 14 aircraft, they went in low. Same result. 10 aircraft shot down, 20 men killed. No hits on any carriers. Torpedo Squadron, 3 from Yorktown, 12 aircraft, 10 shot down, 21 men killed, no hits. In 30 minutes, the Japanese had destroyed 41 American aircraft and killed 70 aircrewmen. The torpedo attacks had been a slaughter. Complete failure. Not a single torpedo hit. The Japanese carriers were untouched. Their combat air patrol was triumphant. Their deck crews were recovering aircraft, refueling, rearming, preparing for another strike. The Japanese thought they'd won. The American torpedo attacks had failed completely. The carriers were safe. They could recover their aircraft, launch another strike on Midway, finish the job. The invasion could proceed as planned. But the torpedo bombers had done something crucial. They'd pulled the Japanese fighters down to sea level. Every Zero was low, chasing torpedo bombers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn down from altitude, and at 10:22, while the Zeros were still low, while the Japanese carriers had their decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, the American dive bombers arrived, 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wide McCluskey. They'd been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, running low On fuel, about to turn back, then McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer heading northeast at full speed. He followed it. The destroyer was racing to catch up with the carrier force. At 10:22, McCluskey looked down and saw all 4 Japanese carriers. No fighter, cover above them, Zeros still down low, carriers with aircraft on deck, fuel, lines connected, bombs stacked, perfect targets. McCluskey split his formation. Half would attack Kaga, half would attack Akagi. The dive bombers rolled in, 70 degrees dives, speeds over 300 miles per hour. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the dive bombers kept coming. Cargo was hit by 4 bombs in 2 minutes. 1 hit the flight deck near the island. 1 hit amidship. 1 hit near the forward elevator. 1 hit aft. The bombs penetrated the deck and detonated in the hangar. Fuel fires exploded. Armed aircraft started cooking off. Bombs detonated. Torpedoes exploded. Within minutes, cargo was a blazing wreck. Kagi was hit by 1 bomb, just 1, but it was enough. The bomb hit near the amidships elevator. It penetrated to the hangar deck where aircraft were being armed and fueled. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Fuel fires, bomb detonations, the carrier's fire suppression system failed. Flames spread. Within 20 minutes, Akagi was abandoned. At the same time, dive bombers from Yorktown attacked Saru. 3 bomb hits, same result. Fires, explosions, abandoned ship. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. Kaga would sink that evening. Akagi would be scuttled the next morning. Soryu would sink in the afternoon. Over 1,700 Japanese sailors would die on those 3 ships. Hiru was the only Japanese carrier left. Horror. Aircraft had been on a separate mission when the American dive bombers struck. At 12:45, Hiru launched a counter strike. Dive bombers and fighters. They found Yorktown, hit her with 3 bombs, left her dead in the water. Then Hiru launched a second strike. Torpedo bombers hit Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. The carrier was abandoned. She would sink on June 7 after being hit by a Japanese submarine. But Hiru's revenge was short-lived. At 5:03 in the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiru. 4 bomb hits. Same result as the other carriers. Fires, explosions. Hiru would sink the next morning. By sunset on June 4, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The same 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The same 4 carriers that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, all gone in one day. The Japanese lost 248 aircraft, 357 men, and their offensive capability in the Pacific. The Americans lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The exchange rate was devastating for Japan. 10 Japanese killed for every American, for carriers for 1. And the strategic initiative in the Pacific permanently shifted to the United States. Admiral Yamamoto, watching from the Yamato 300m away, knew the battle was lost. On June 5, he ordered a general withdrawal. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The Japanese fleet retreated west. The Americans pursued but couldn't catch them. The battle was over, and none of it would have been possible without the water shortage ruse. Without Rochefort's confirmation that AF was Midway, without the intelligence that put American carriers in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, the Japanese had no idea how the Americans knew. Thereafter, action reports were filled with confusion. How did the Americans know where to be? How did they know when to strike? How did they position their carriers so perfectly? The Japanese never suspected the Americans had broken their codes. They blamed bad luck. They blamed poor scouting. They blamed everything except the truth. American codebreakers had read their mail. Japanese pilots returning from Midway reported that American forces had been waiting for them, that American carriers were in position, that American aircraft knew exactly when to strike. Japanese intelligence officers tried to figure out what had gone wrong. They analyzed their radio security. They changed code books. They changed procedures, but they never figured it out. They never realized that a simple water shortage Message had confirmed their target and doomed their carriers. Admiral Nagumo, who commanded the carrier strike force, survived Midway. He would be haunted by the battle for the rest of his life. Why had the American carriers been there? Why had they struck at exactly the right moment? He never got satisfactory answers. He would commit suicide in 1944, during the Battle of Saipan. Yamamoto knew Midway was a disaster. Japan had lost its best carriers, its best pilots, its offensive momentum. The Americans would never be weaker than they were in June 1942, and Japan had failed to destroy them. Yamamoto told his staff that Japan could not win a long war against American industrial capacity. Midway had guaranteed the war would be long. Yamamoto would be killed in April 1943 when American Codebreakers intercepted his travel plans and P-38 fighters shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The Battle of Midway changed the Pacific War. Before Midway, Japan had been advancing everywhere. After Midway, Japan would never again initiate a major offensive operation. The Americans took the initiative Guadalcanal in August 1942, the Solomon Islands campaign island hopping across the Pacific. Every step forward was possible because Midway had broken Japanese carrier strength. Historians call Midway the turning point of the Pacific War. Military historian John Keegan called it the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. The battle proved that aircraft carriers were now the dominant naval weapon. It proved that intelligence could overcome material disadvantages. And it proved that individual decisions like Rocheport's water shortage ruse could change the course of history. But Rocheport never received credit for Midway during the war. Admiral Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal in June 1942. The recommendation was blocked by Admiral King. King's chief of staff, who personally disliked Rocheport, ensured the medal was denied. The official reason given was that Rocheport had merely used tools prepared by others. That was a lie. Rocheport had built Station Hypo from scratch. He'd trained the team. He developed the techniques. He'd made the critical decisions. In October 1942, Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo. Washington wanted control over intelligence operations. They didn't like Russia's independence. They didn't like his habit of reporting directly to Nimitz instead of through official channels. They didn't like that he'd been right when they'd been wrong. So, they transferred him to the West Coast and put him in command of a floating dry dock. Rochefort spent the rest of the war doing administrative work, building dry docks, supervising logistics, important work, but nothing like Station Hypo. He never ran another intelligence operation. His reward for saving the Pacific Fleet was exiled to a desk job. The men who'd worked with him at Station Hypo were outraged. They knew what Rochefort had done. They knew his intelligence had won Midway. They tried to get him recognized. They wrote letters. They filed reports. They testified to investigators. But Washington wouldn't budge. The bureaucrats who'd been wrong about Midway weren't about to admit it by giving Rochefort a medal. Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer and Russia's friend, never stopped fighting for recognition. After the war, Layton wrote books, gave interviews, testified before Congress. He wanted people to understand that Midway wasn't just luck, it was intelligence. It was Rocher. And Rocher had been punished for being right. Thomas Deere, who'd run the cryptanalysis section at Hypo, became a rear admiral after the war. He made sure every young intelligence officer he met knew Rocheport's story. He wanted them to understand that doing the right thing sometimes meant breaking the rules. That serving the mission mattered more than pleasing bureaucrats in Washington. Jasper Holmes stayed in the Navy after the war. He became a rear admiral. He wrote a book about the intelligence war in the Pacific. He made sure Rochefort's story was told. He made sure people understood that the water shortage message wasn't just clever, it was necessary. Without it, Washington would never have committed the carriers. Without it, Midway would have been lost. After the war, Rocher stayed in the Navy until 1953. He retired as a captain. He worked as a civilian consultant on military projects. He never talked much about his wartime service. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he worked on some communications projects in Hawaii. That's all. His former colleagues kept trying to get him recognized. They submitted new recommendations for the Distinguished Service Medal. They gathered testimonials from pilots who'd fought at Midway. They collected evidence of Rochefort's contribution. Every request was denied. The bureaucracy wouldn't admit it had been wrong. In 1976, Rochefort died in Torrance, California. He was 76 years old. His obituary mentioned his Navy service. It did not mention Station Hypo. It did not mention that he'd broken the code that won Midway. It did not mention that his water shortage RS had saved the Pacific Fleet. He died without official recognition for the most important intelligence breakthrough of the Pacific War. But his colleagues didn't give up. After his death, they intensified their campaign. They had nothing to lose now. They could be more aggressive. They contacted members of Congress. They contacted the Secretary of the Navy. They contacted the President. They demanded Rochefort receive the recognition he'd earned 33 years earlier. In 1985, 9 years after his death, the Navy finally awarded Rocheforт the Distinguished Service Medal, a posthumous recognition for his work at Midway. The medal was presented to his daughter at a ceremony in Washington. Admiral Nimitz had recommended this medal in 1942. It had taken 43 years to be approved. In 1986, Rochefort received a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. President Reagan presented the medal to Rochefort's family at a White House ceremony. The citation said his codering work had been instrumental in the victory at Midway and had significantly contributed to the Allied victory in the Pacific. In 2000, the National Security Agency inducted Rochefort into their Hall of Honor. The citation described him as one of the greatest CRYP analysts in American history. His techniques for intelligence analysis became standard practice throughout the intelligence community. In 2012, a building at the NSA facility at Pearl Harbor was named the Captain Joseph J. Rocher Building. The building stands on the same site where Station Hypo had operated, where Rochefort and his team had worked in that cold basement, where they'd broken the code, where they'd saved the fleet. These recognitions meant something. They acknowledged what Rochefort had done. But they came too late. He never knew that his country had finally recognized his contribution. He died believing he'd been forgotten, that the bureaucrats had won, that his work had been erased from history. The officers who survived Midway because of Rocher's intelligence never forgot him. Admiral Spruance, who commanded the Enterprise and Hornet at Midway, testified repeatedly about Rochefort's contribution. He told military historians that without Rochefort's intelligence, the American carriers would never have been in position, the battle would have been lost. Admiral Nimitz never wavered in his support for Rochefort. Nimitz understood exactly what Rochefort had accomplished. He knew that the water shortage ruse had been the key to confirming Midway. Nimitz fought for years to secure Rochefort the recognition he deserved, but bureaucratic rivals in Washington blocked the effort. The cryptanalysts who worked with Rochefort at Station Hypo remembered him as demanding but brilliant. He pushed them relentlessly, 12-hour shifts, 14-hour shifts, days without leaving the basement, but he pushed himself even harder. He never asked anyone to do anything he wouldn't do himself. They respected him for that. They knew their work mattered, and they trusted Rochefort completely. The physical remnants of Rochefort's work are largely gone. The basement where Station Hypo operated was demolished decades ago, replaced by a modern building. Yet deep in the archives, the original decoded messages survive. Rochefort's handwriting on analysis sheets, annotations on intercepts, intelligence summaries that Nimitz used to plan Midway's defense. These documents are tangible proof of the work that changed history. Military historians analyzing Station Hypo records estimate that Rochefort's intelligence work at Midway prevented the loss of at least 2 American carriers and potentially 15,000 casualties. Without that early warning, the carriers would have been caught unprepared, just like at Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese would have achieved total surprise. The outcome would have been catastrophic. Rochefort's impact went far beyond Midway. His methods of establishing direct intelligence reporting to fleet commanders became the model for wartime intelligence operations. Before Rochefort, intelligence passed through layers of bureaucracy, by the time it reached commanders, it was often too late to act upon. Rockefort proved that intelligence must be actionable, reaching decision-makers immediately, a principle that transformed the Navy's approach. The water shortage ruse itself became a legendary example of intelligence tradecraft, still taught at intelligence schools today. How do you confirm information you cannot verify directly? You create a test, send controlled information, and watch how the enemy responds. Simple, elegant, and devastating when executed correctly. That is how intelligence wins wars, not through massive spy networks or elaborate schemes, but through precise, targeted operations that confirm critical information at critical moments. Rockefort didn't need hundreds of agents in Tokyo. He didn't need satellites or advanced technology. He needed one false message about a broken water plant and the patience to wait for the Japanese response. The consequences of Midway rippled across the entire Pacific theater. Japan's naval aviation never recovered. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented years of experience and training. The pilots who perished were irreplaceable. Japan began the war with roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified pilots, but after Midway and the subsequent Guadalcanal campaign, that number was drastically reduced. By late 1943, Japanese carrier pilots flew with only a fraction of the training of their predecessors. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity, which Yamamoto had feared, began to show its strength. By the end of 1942, new Essex-class carriers were entering service, the first, USS Essex, commissioned in December, with more following every few months. By the end of 1943, the Navy had more carriers than it had lost during the entire war. Japan could not match this production. The carriers sunk at Midway were irreplaceable, and the strategic initiative permanently shifted to the United States. Before Midway, American forces were largely defensive. After Midway, they dictated where and when to engage: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. Japan spent the remainder of the war reacting instead of initiating operations. The intelligence methods Rockefort pioneered, direct reporting from intelligence units to operational commanders, immediate analysis and dissemination, and integration of intelligence into operational planning, became standard practice. In 1942, these principles were revolutionary. Later, when American codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's travel plans in April 1943, they reported directly to Nimitz, who immediately authorized the intercept mission. P-38 fighters were airborne within hours, and Yamamoto was dead within days, a mission made possible only by the direct reporting structure Rockefort had established. The Japanese never realized their codes had been broken. They continued using JN-25 variants, modifying and complicating them, but never abandoning the system. American cryptanalysts kept reading their messages. Every major Japanese operation for the remainder of the war was partially or entirely compromised by American codebreaking. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carriers ambushed the Japanese fleet because codebreakers had warned of their approach. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, and Japanese naval aviation was effectively eliminated as a fighting force, a victory rooted in Rockefort's intelligence methods at Midway. The lesson of Midway was not just that intelligence matters, but that intelligence requires trust. Nimitz trusted Rockefort based on a personal relationship and a proven track record. When Rockefort said AF was Midway, Nimitz believed him despite Washington's disagreement, and that trust saved the Pacific Fleet. Modern intelligence operations still struggle with the same issues Rockefort faced: bureaucratic rivalries, chain-of-command disputes, analysts seeking patterns versus administrators demanding certainty, and tension between field intelligence and headquarters. Rockefort's story reminds us that the most important contributions often come from those who break rules, bypass bureaucracies, trust their judgment over official policy, and risk their careers to do what is right. Rockefort paid a personal price for being correct. He was sidelined, denied recognition, and forgotten. But the pilots who flew at Midway remembered. The sailors who survived because American carriers were in the right position remembered. Intelligence officers who learned from Rockefort's methods remembered. Eventually, history remembered. The water shortage ruse remains one of the most elegant intelligence operations in military history, solving an impossible problem with an impossibly simple solution. How do you prove a fact when your enemy controls the only evidence? You trick them into providing that evidence themselves. Rockefort understood that sometimes the best way to reveal the truth is to create a lie and watch the enemy respond. James Anderson, the young seaman from Oregon who died on the Arizona, never knew that his death would inspire Rockefort to prevent another Pearl Harbor. Anderson was one of 2,403 Americans who died that Sunday morning. Their deaths haunted Rockefort for the rest of his life. He endured endless hours in the cold basement because he could not bear the thought of more names being added to that casualty list. He could not endure another Pearl Harbor, and because of his work, there wasn't one.
The Japanese never again achieved strategic surprise against the American Pacific Fleet. American carriers were never caught unprepared.
American forces knew when and where the Japanese would strike, and that knowledge, gained from Rockefeller's team in that basement at Pearl Harbor, saved thousands of lives.
The irony is that Rockefeller's greatest contribution was preventing something that never occurred.
Midway could have been another disaster, another day of American carriers burning, another 2,000 dead, and potentially the end of American resistance in the Pacific, but it was not. One commander in a bathrobe, working in a cold basement with a team of linguists, mathematicians, and musicians, broke a code and confirmed a target with a fake message about water, and the course of history was changed. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps share more forgotten Second World War stories. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters and deserves to be remembered.
We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below sharing where you're watching from.
Our community stretches from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special.
Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive.